whenever. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and share some ideas from our book, The Bonfire Moment, that I co-authored with Josh Yellen. I come from a world of technology, and in my mind, startups are the place where a lot of the net new ideas and innovations are going to emerge from, and really where the net new um, uh, kind of jobs will emerge from. And so, a lot of the work I've done over the years really has helped me understand what really is at the heart of the very low success rate among startups. I understand that not everyone here is probably building a startup or wants to build a startup. It's not for everyone. Um, but I hope that some of the ideas in this, in what I will share in our book, will anyway resonate in the kind of work that you do. After all, technology advances, um, whereas human nature and the human condition is quite universal and quite static for the most part. And so I think there might be some ideas here for everyone. Um, we start the book with this idea, really by a former Google senior leader and now a partner in Sequoia Capital, which is one of the more, one of the more popular venture capitalists in the world. That engineering is easy, people are hard, and really what that's pointing to is not that engineering isn't hard, because that's really difficult as well, but where we oftentimes see technologists stumble is really when it comes to the human factor in the work that they do. We know this because in a study that was done out of Harvard a few years ago, they had surveyed a bunch of investors, and they asked them, if you look at your portfolio and think of the companies that had failed, what were the top reasons for failure? And 65% of startups that failed because of people issues. And that was things like, co-founder conflict, the inability to hire the right people, or not letting go of toxic individuals fast enough. It's not building the right culture in the team. It's waiting on small, seemingly kind of insignificant challenges and conflicts within the team that eventually grow really large. And we also know that that investors, when they think about who to invest in, they do think of the team as really the number one by far factor of making these investment decisions. So in our work with startups, we've really seen that there are two plot lines that tend to happen, or that tend to be told. The first plot line is the public story. It's often told in, public stages, podcasts, startup conferences, and it's usually a story of the underdog trying to disrupt the incumbents. A personal story that includes, finding some friction in engaging in a certain type of product or a certain type of activity through their day, and decided to just solve it themselves, and they struggle through it, but they eventually succeed. What we find, though, is that the second plot line tends to be a lot more of the reality, which is behind closed doors. There is moments of doubt, struggling to figure out kind of, why am I doing more than others, and yet getting the same in terms of compensation or recognition for this work. It's feeling that this good friend of mine that I built this company with is no longer good for the company, and how do I let them go? Is that being disloyal, and how do I wrestle with that? And a lot of these stories, a lot of the challenges that exist in this second plot line, a lot of these were told to us by hundreds, if not thousands, of founders around the world as we were, supporting them through this. A lot of this work really comes from the work we had done in Google for Startups, where we had scaled a leadership, like a founders program that really focused on the people challenges in these startups. And at some point, this program reached, this program took a life of its own, reached founders in 70 countries across basically all continents where you can find startups. and reached several thousand startup founders. And at some point, I remember when we brought this program to Nigeria, which was maybe about 4 or 5 years into scaling this program, we started to get questions around, well, where's the book that captured all that that you've learned in in collecting data on these founders and hearing all their stories that otherwise don't get told in open stages. And I remember also at some point when we brought the program to Sao Paulo, some of the founders there, uh, when we came back, actually, I should say, to bring the program there a second time, some of the founders that had attended the first version kind of very sheepishly apologized to us and saying, Martin, I'm sorry, but we took photos of your slides and we kind of did our own bootleg version in Portuguese and ran this with a bunch of startups in our backyard, and they were very grateful for it. And it clicked for us, for Josh and I, and thought, this is probably, we should probably open source this workshop and we should probably help them kind of do their own bootleg version. And so what we do with this book is two things. One is we share all that we've learned, all the patterns, and with all the data that we've collected, we share kind of all the things that we've learned on these founders. And part two is we open source the workshop. And so everyone can just pick this book up and kind of get an insider view of what we do with these founders, and give you basically all that you need, all the instructions, all the steps, all the kind of behind the scenes facilitator considerations to then run this yourselves. What I want to do in the next maybe 15 minutes or so is or 10 minutes or so, is to walk you through just a couple of ideas that are in this book, are in part one of the book. If you have interest, after we can talk about the workshop itself, but that's not going to be what I talk about now. But I want to lay out a little bit of how we thought about using the data and some key ideas. So really what we did was, as we were scaling this program around the world, we were collecting data on all these founders. And the beauty of that is we could then look into this data set and isolate what statisticians will call the tails, the best and the least effective founders. Why this is important is that in many startup stages, you often find the kind of successful or reasonably successful founder who then stands up on a stage and talks about their top 10 learnings. And when you compile all these learnings side by side, you'll realize they don't actually fully cohere. Some of them are, in fact, maybe are in opposition of each other. And what you have there is what psychologists would call survivorship bias, which is it's important that you don't just look at the people who succeed and ask them why they think they succeed. What you want to do instead is to ask both the people who succeed and those who don't succeed, and see what they did and see what the difference is. Because sometimes the things that successful people do are things that the unsuccessful people also did, and yet they failed anyway, right? And so what we do with this study is we look at both and we compare the two populations as a way to overcome survivorship bias. So there are two traps that, there are four traps that we talk about in the book. I want to talk about two of them. And the first is the trap of speed. And what you'll find is in a startup, in a garage, but also in a startup within a larger company, whenever you have big goals and tight constraints on resources, really what results in this is kind of the allure of running really, really fast. This is kind of the lean startup ethos. It's very much kind of the scrappy, move fast and break things kind of ethos. And we find that actually, while this is very appealing, there is a trap to that speed. What we find in these worlds is there are really two kinds of games these founders need to play. There's a short game and the long game. The short game optimizes on using their cash wisely, and so they measure things like burn rate and runway. Whereas the long game is about assuming that we're going to grow really big. Like, how do we build it today for the long term? And so there's a lot of focus on keeping tech debt low. working with investors that not just give money but also add really good advice. There's a focus on being scrappy in the short game. In the long game, it's about being excellent. The short game really looks for fresh, fragile ideas, and the long game understands that these ideas are actually cheap, and it's execution that ultimately matters. In the short game, it requires a great product. In the long game, it requires a great team. And so it's this difference of thinking about your role as being a chief bricklayer and being a chief architect, where really you're trying to build something that requires long-term thinking and working with people to build that. And so the big question is, how do you win the short game without risking the long game? Because both games are really important. And what we find all too often is that under so much pressure and high expectations, the long game gets forgotten. And really, what behavioral scientists have a really interesting way to think about this phenomenon. They call it hyperbolic discounting. It's a computational error we as humans make, where kind of when we think about things in the present, we tend to value things pretty accurately. But as things come to us later in the future, somehow we apply a discount factor. And in the world of startups, the short game are things like product launch deadlines, pitches, investor meetings, sales targets. And the long game tends to be things like, hiring smart and being slow to hire, holding on to until you find really the person who can really be a value add and a culture add to the team. It's resolving issues with the team decisively and early on. It's figuring out the culture. It's managing team morale. All these things will be something that people will apply a discount rate to. It's not procrastination, because procrastination to some extent is a motivational error. This is more of a computational error. It's how much do you actually think these things are important. And we know that actually, the benefits of some of these long game things like a strong culture are very valuable. There's a really interesting study by some French economists that looked at stock returns of the I believe this is S&P 500, and they looked across multiple decades of data. And what they wanted to understand was if they parsed out the companies with strong cultures, and these are kind of the companies in the great companies to work for list that Fortune publishes every year. If you parse that out and you compare that to their peers, what they found was that actually a strong culture was very subtle. The benefits were very subtle in calm waters. So you look at kind of the years out here, when the economy is good, you don't really see an upside. But when the economy is really bad, like in this case, the dot-com crash or the global financial crisis, you will see what they call a monthly alpha. And alpha is, in financial term, is basically the ability of a company to outperform their peers. And you can see that a 1.5 monthly kind of delta above their peers is quite a significant amount. And you'll see that the benefit is really pronounced in these stormy periods, which is not to say that you should wait for the stormy periods to build a strong culture, because if you enter these stormy periods, which you can't predict, with a bad culture, well, you're too late at that point. And so what we encourage our founders to do in this program is we have a list of 20 critical sources of drag of team drag, as we call it. And these are the 20 things that we've seen just time and time again over the years of observing these founders, the things that they get tripped up on. And if they don't make decisions on it or talk about them early on, they become things that really kill and strain the startup down the line. And if you have the copy of the book, you will find it in there. I believe this is chapter 2. Or we just also have these lists available that you can download on our website. There's another resource that you'll find actually on our website and also in the book called the User Guide, which is really a practical way to get the team together to then hone in on, well, how do you best work with me? How do you get the best out of me? And kind of what I have called out here is it's so important for founders and for really for team members to talk about like why are you here, what motivates you to be here. And in our work with founders, we found that it's really three things. It's either head, heart, or wallet. It's I'm here because head, because of the intellectual challenge of solving this difficult problem with an elegant technological solution. And then there's heart, which is um, I'm here because I'm committed to a certain user group and I want to do good on them. And then there's the wallet, which is yes, the financial wallet, but there's also a social wallet, which is I get to do this and I get to affiliate with people. I get a title that I won't otherwise be able to get. I will be able to shake hands with people, and that gets certain people motivated. And the idea here is that you want to understand the motivators of the people you work with, and then tailor the work and help them find meaning based on what motivates them in the work. All right, I'm watching the clock as well, and so let me keep going here. But the second trap is the trap of the inner circle, and this is by far the thing that really gets at at these startups. Peter Senge, a former MIT professor, said it really well, and I'll repeat this twice because it's a little bit it takes a bit to take in. But he goes, the collective intelligence of a leadership team is often lower than the average intelligence of team members. Another way to say this is, when you take individuals separate, if you take people as individuals, they tend to be smarter, and when you put them together as a team, they somehow their intelligence deteriorates. And a big reason for that is this trap of the inner circle. What do we know from the data? So we know that co-founders. So most companies will found with co-founders, and most co-founders are going to be friends and family. And we know that actually people who co-found where their origin story is that they were first family and friends, those are the least stable partnerships. And then acquaintances tend to be a little bit more stable. And then the most stable types of partnerships are past coworkers. And the reason for that is, past coworkers, you see each other in a professional setting, you understand each other's work ethic. You also see their skill sets, and you can kind of understand, to what extent do they complement or replicate my skill set. Part of the reason why this is Noam Wasserman, formerly at Harvard Business School, the way he explains this is that the damage, when you think of the relationship of friends and family, those are very expensive relationships. Not only do you have a personal relationship, but you now have a professional relationship. And so the damage you have when the relationship blows up with friends and family, the value is so much higher. With acquaintances, much lower, and with past coworkers, somewhat in between. But then what you see here is that the likelihood of having sensitive discussions is so much lower with friends and family because of that fear and that really expensive relationship that's at stake. And what you find with past coworkers is that they're willing to put their personal relationship on the line to do what's right for the business. Excuse me. And yet, we know that there are a lot of companies that have been founded by friends and family that have succeeded. So what do they do? Well, what we do know is that it is so important. The founders that do succeed, they really value disagreement and they invite it. They don't just welcome it; they actually invite it. And when we look at our data, when we ask, founders, to what extent is inviting disagreement important? Only 3% of founders think it's important, whereas a significant amount around them, the co-founders and the employees, think it's a lot more important. So somehow there's a bit of an asymmetry here. And so what can you do? So first, you want to increase the quantity of your disagreements. There are two ideas here. So the first one is have a habit of talking about what I call the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is the issues that are obvious to everyone, but no one wants to talk about. And one way that I've done this in the past with teams that I'm not a part of, or to some extent with teams I've been a part of, is I take out a box, almost like an anonymous suggestion box of sorts. I give everyone a post-it and I invite them to say, okay, what do we think are the elephants in the room of this team? And have people write them down and collect them and put them in the box and one at a time read them out. And that kind of gets a really good conversation going. A second idea is kind of a 2-minute hack that I like doing when you are approaching, let's say, a decision point. Um, the person with the most power should speak last, first of all. And what I would do is I would ask the group, okay, take out a post-it, and in 2 minutes, uh, write down how you think about this decision. And the reason why you want them to write it down is because if someone begins to talk about their idea, what tends to happen is an anchoring effect where they ever so slightly gravitate towards maybe the opinions of the most outspoken person in the room or the one with the most power. So you want to capture the greatest amount of variety in the room by having them write down their ideas first. And then you ask the individuals to share their thoughts and give them 2 minutes of uninterrupted time to share their thoughts. A variation of this is you might want to get the more junior person to speak first, because then you might get the freshest ideas there, and they're the most vulnerable to getting anchored. Okay, so that's the first idea of increasing the quantity of your disagreements. And then you want to improve the quality of your disagreements. And here I pull, and one of my favorite stories in the book um, is by this research manager, this lab manager from Xerox PARC. Xerox PARC, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, in the late 70s, early 80s, is probably one of the most prolific places for innovation. This is where the personal computer is invented. This is where you get Apple's, Apple Computer. This is where you get the technology that gives you Pixar, Adobe, 3Com. Kind of, they invented the Ethernet here. It was the place where innovation really thrived. It's just too bad that Xerox didn't capitalize on all of this, but that's a different story. But here you have this lab manager named Robert, and he talked about kind of that his role is not so much to resolve disagreements in this lab, but his role was to convert class 1 disagreements to class 2 disagreements. What did he mean by that? Class 1 disagreements are what he would call, or what we would maybe today call, a straw man argument, which is, let me take your point of view, represent it in the weakest way possible, making it easy for me to then refute. Class 2 disagreements, on the other hand, are what we might call a strong man argument as opposed to a straw man argument, which is, can I take your idea that I disagree with, represent your idea, or read back to you the idea in a way that you are satisfied with, and then only then, when you're satisfied with how I've represented your idea, then I would then come in and share my point of view and clash with your idea. And his role was to spot class 1 disagreements everywhere in his lab and elevate them to class 2 disagreements. And that was kind of, from a facilitator standpoint, that was simply the task at hand. And so as a leader of your team, or as a facilitator of team processes, you want to have your radars up and looking for class 1 disagreements and elevating them to class 2 disagreements. All right, that's the trap of the inner circle. There are a couple more traps that we talk about in the book: the trap of the maverick mindset and the trap of confidence. The trap of the maverick mindset, maybe as a sidebar, is probably my favorite chapter in the book. That was a chapter I loved writing the most. And so if you're interested in that, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But let me pause here, and we can kind of get into questions.